The morning he moved my property markers, I was standing 20 feet away in my kitchen, watching him through the window with a cup of tea going cold in my hand. He didn't know I was there. That was the first mistake he made. It was not his last. My name is not important. What matters is this. I am a 63-year-old widow who has lived in the same small house on Lindenweg for 31 years. My husband Walter built the garden wall himself, one summer weekend at a time, using a spirit level and a stubbornness I found both irritating and deeply comforting. He died 4 years ago. The house is not large. The garden is not impressive, but it is mine, every centimetre of it, measured and documented and paid for in full. I know where my property ends because I have read the deeds so many times I could recite the boundary coordinates in my sleep. His name was Gregor Mans. He had bought the lot next door 14 months earlier, the old Brenner property, which had sat empty for years after old Mrs. Brenner went to the care home. He introduced himself with a handshake that lasted 1 second too long and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He told me he was planning something tasteful. 4 units, he said, sympathetic to the neighbourhood character. He used the word sympathetic 3 times in 5 minutes. I noticed that. For the first few months, things were quiet. There were surveyors. There were architects. There were men in expensive boots who walked around the lot taking photographs and speaking quietly into their phones. I watched from my kitchen window the way you watch weather forming on the horizon. Not with panic, just with attention. The trouble started on a Tuesday in March. I remember because it was the day I had planned to prune the old rose hedge along the southern boundary, the one Walter planted the year we moved in. I had my gloves on. I had my clippers. I stepped outside and immediately noticed something wrong. The boundary marker post in the far corner of my garden, the small orange-painted iron rod that had been there since the original survey in 1987, was gone. In its place, set back by what I estimated at roughly 2 metres, was a fresh wooden stake with a red ribbon tied to it. I stood there for a moment. I took a breath. I looked at the stake. I looked at the space between where the original marker had been and where this new one now stood. 2 metres. Across the full width of the southern boundary. That was a strip of land, perhaps 2 metres by 22. Not enormous in absolute terms, but it included the rose hedge Walter had planted. It included the old apple tree. It included the corner of the garden where I kept my compost bins and my seed storage shed. And it was mine. I did not go over and pull the stake out. I did not call out to anyone. I went back inside, took off my gloves, and sat down at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea. I thought about Walter. I thought about the way he used to say, "Never react to a provocation before you understand its full dimensions." He had been an engineer. He thought in systems. I had learned over 31 years of marriage to think the same way. I got out my folder. Every house has a folder, or it should. Mine is a green cardboard accordion file that lives in the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside it, I keep the original purchase contract, the land registry entry, the building permit from 1991, when we added the conservatory, the insurance documents, and, crucially, the original survey document from 1987, when the entire street was formally measured and registered. The document is printed on heavy paper that has gone slightly yellow at the edges. It is signed by the surveyor, stamped by the municipal land registry, and it contains coordinates, very specific coordinates. I spread it on the table and read it again, carefully, even though I already knew what it said. Then I made a phone call. Her name is Ingrid Hoffmann. She is 71 years old, and she spent 38 years as a licensed land surveyor for the state authority before she retired. She lives 4 streets away. I had met her at a neighbourhood association meeting 2 years earlier, and we had become, in the careful, self-contained way of 2 women who have both lived alone for a long time, something like friends. We walked together on Sunday mornings sometimes. She had very good boots and very strong opinions about property law. I told her what I had seen. There was a short silence on the phone. "Don't touch anything," she said. "Don't move anything. Don't speak to him yet. I'll come Thursday morning with my equipment." I said, "I was hoping you'd say something like that." She said, "Also, do you have a drone?" I did not have a drone, but my neighbour's son, a young man named Felix, who lived 2 doors down and flew the thing recreationally over the fields at the edge of town, was very happy to help when I explained the situation over his garden fence the following afternoon. He was 24, enthusiastic, and deeply offended on my behalf. Young people, I have found, have a very strong instinct for injustice when it is explained clearly. On Thursday morning, Ingrid arrived with a measuring wheel, a laser distance meter, and the kind of focused calm that comes from decades of professional precision. Felix arrived 20 minutes later with his drone in a backpack and a thermos of coffee. We stood in my garden in the pale spring sunlight, and Ingrid took measurements. It took her less than 40 minutes to confirm what I already knew. The original boundary marker was gone. The new stake was set 1.87 metres inside my legal property line. The strip of land being claimed was unambiguously, documentably, legally mine. He moved it himself or had someone move it, Ingrid said, not as an accusation, but as a technical observation. The ground around the original position is disturbed. You can see the plug of earth. Felix flew the drone. He made several careful passes, filming from above, capturing the position of the new stake relative to the fence line and the original marker hole and the surrounding landscape. He filmed for 20 minutes. The footage was steady and clear and showed everything. I thanked them both. I made more tea. I put the drone footage on a USB drive and labelled it in my careful handwriting. Boundary documentation, March. I put it in the green folder with the survey document. Then I waited. 2 days later, Gregor Mans knocked on my door. He was wearing a dark coat and carrying a document wallet. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say and is confident in the performance. I let him in. I offered him coffee. He declined, which told me something about his intentions. Frau Bergmann, he said, which is my name. I wanted to speak with you about the boundary situation. I said, of course. Please sit down. He sat. He opened his document wallet and placed a paper on my kitchen table. It was a printout of a map, clearly altered, showing the boundary of my property ending approximately 2 meters short of where it actually ended. It looked official. It was not official, but it was designed to look that way. As you can see, sir, he said, with a patience that was clearly practiced, the actual property line runs here. He pointed to the line on his map. I think there may have been some confusion over the years. These things happen with older properties. Markers shift, fences move, people assume. I looked at his map. I looked at him. I said, I see. I want to be fair about this, he said. I could simply proceed with the build as planned, but because we're neighbours, I'm willing to offer you a small compensation for the adjustment. A goodwill payment, something modest but reasonable. I said, how modest? He named a figure. It was insultingly low. It was the kind of number a person names when they believe the other person has no alternative. I said, I'll need to think about it. He nodded, as if this was the expected and acceptable response. He stood up. He picked up his document wallet. He was almost at the door when he paused, turned, and said the thing that I have since replayed in my mind many times. Not with anger, but with a kind of cold clarity. Frau Bergmann, he said, you should be grateful I'm offering anything at all. A woman in your position on your own, with a property this size. You should be practical about these things. He said it pleasantly. That was the part that stayed with me, the pleasantness. I said, thank you for coming by, Herr Mans. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment. I looked at the photograph on the wall, the one of Walter and me in the garden the summer we planted the roses. Then I went back to the kitchen table, opened the green folder, and began to write a list. The list had 4 items on it. The first was contact land registry. The second was request official survey through municipality. The third was speak to a property lawyer. The fourth was find out when the next planning committee meeting is scheduled. I am methodical. Walter used to say I was the most methodical person he'd ever met, and he meant it as a compliment, even when it drove him slightly mad. Over the following 3 weeks, I worked through the list. The land registry confirmed that my property boundaries were exactly where the 1987 survey documents said they were. The official municipal surveyor, when I submitted a formal request for a boundary verification, confirmed the same thing in writing and noted that the original marker post appeared to have been removed, which was a violation of property law. The property lawyer I consulted, a quiet woman named Dr. Feller, who wore reading glasses on a chain and charged by the quarter hour, told me I had an exceptionally strong case, and that the documentation I had assembled was, in her words, unusually thorough. She also told me something else. She told me that Gregor Mans had submitted a planning application to the Municipal Building Committee for his 4-unit development. The application was currently under review. The committee meeting at which it would be formally considered was scheduled for 6 weeks away. And one of the requirements for planning approval was that the submitted site plan accurately reflected the legal property boundaries. His site plan, she showed me, used the false boundary. I sat with that for a moment. I thanked her. I paid her invoice promptly. I went home and made tea. Felix came by that evening. He had, without being asked, done something rather clever. He had taken his drone footage and overlaid it with the coordinate data from the 1987 survey document using a mapping application on his laptop. The result was a visual document that showed, with unmistakable precision, the position of the original boundary, the position of the new stake, and the exact discrepancy between them. It was the kind of thing that would be immediately comprehensible to anyone looking at it, even someone with no technical background. "I can print it at A3, he said. I said, "Please print 3 copies. He printed 6. He was enthusiastic. Ingrid came for tea the following Sunday. She brought her own milk because she knew I kept only the low-fat kind, which she considered an affront. We sat in the conservatory, the one Walter built, looking out at the garden, at the rose hedge and the apple tree, and the strip of land that someone had decided to simply take because he thought no one would stop him. "He's going to the committee in 6 weeks, I said. Ingrid was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea. She said, "I know one of the technical reviewers on the planning committee, retired colleague. He's thorough." "I wasn't going to ask," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." She also told me something I had not known. In her years as a state surveyor, she had seen this particular type of boundary manipulation before. It was not common, but it was not unknown. Developers occasionally moved markers on properties owned by elderly people, particularly those living alone, calculating that the disruption and legal complexity of challenging it would be more than the individual could manage. It was, she said, a form of predation that relied entirely on the target not knowing what they had and not having the resources or confidence to defend it. "He picked the wrong neighbour," I said. Ingrid smiled into her tea. "He really did." The weeks passed. Construction on the adjacent lot continued. I watched the groundwork being done, watched the equipment moving, watched the crew working to a schedule that had clearly been planned around the assumption that planning approval would come through without difficulty. Mans visited once more, briefly, to ask if I had made a decision about his offer. I told him I was still considering my options. He nodded with the confidence of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility of losing. I was, during this time, outwardly unremarkable. I gardened, I walked with Ingrid on Sunday mornings. I had Felix over twice more to refine the visual documentation. I exchanged several letters with the Municipal Land Registry and the Planning Authority. I attended one preliminary meeting with Dr. Feller in which we prepared a formal objection to the planning application on the grounds of the inaccurate site plan. The objection was submitted 10 days before the committee meeting within the statutory window, accompanied by the 1987 survey document, Ingrid's technical measurement report, the drone footage stills, Felix's overlay analysis, and the official municipal surveyor's written confirmation of the boundary discrepancy. Dr. Feller also submitted, separately, a formal complaint to the relevant authority about the removal of the boundary marker, which is a criminal offence under property law. I did not tell Mans any of this. There was no reason to. The building committee meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the council chamber of the local municipal building, a room with fluorescent lighting and rows of chairs that were more comfortable than they looked. It was open to the public. I arrived 15 minutes early with my green folder, 3 copies of the documentation package, and Ingrid, who was wearing her good coat and the expression she used when she was about to be very precise in a public setting. Felix came too, with his laptop, in case anyone needed to see the overlay footage on a screen. He had also, I noticed, brought a second thermos of coffee, which he offered to the committee secretary before the meeting started. The secretary accepted gratefully. Felix had good instincts. The room filled up more than I had expected. There were other neighbours, some of whom I knew, and some I had only seen at a distance. There were 2 people from the local residents' association. There was a journalist from the local paper, a young woman with a notebook who had apparently been tipped off that the meeting might be interesting. I did not know who had tipped her off. I had my suspicions about Felix. Gregor Mans arrived with 2 people, a man in a suit who was clearly his lawyer, and a younger man carrying a large rolled-up plan. Mans was in a dark jacket, and he had the bearing of someone who walks into rooms expecting to control them. He saw me sitting in the 3rd row with my folder on my lap. Something passed briefly across his face. Not concern, more like mild irritation. The way you feel when a minor administrative detail requires slightly more attention than anticipated. He looked away. He settled into his seat at the front. He conferred quietly with his lawyer, the committee chairperson, a compact woman in her 50s named Frau Drexel, opened the meeting and worked through the agenda with efficient, no-nonsense energy. When she reached the item for Mans's planning application, she introduced it briefly and invited the applicant's representative to present. The lawyer stood up. He was practiced and smooth. He summarised the project. 4 residential units, sympathetic design, positive contribution to housing supply in the area. He referenced the site plan. He mentioned the timeline. He spoke for 8 minutes and used the word community 3 times. Frau Drexel thanked him and said the committee had received a formal objection. She invited the objecting party to present. I stood up. I had not prepared a speech. I had prepared evidence. There is a difference, and it matters. I said, "Thank you. My name is Margaret Bergman. I live at number 14 Lindenweg, directly adjacent to the proposed development site. I have submitted a formal objection on technical grounds, which I would like to briefly explain." I set the documentation package on the table in front of the committee. I handed copies to the clerk. I spoke for 11 minutes. I was calm. I was specific. I used numbers. I explained that the site plan submitted with the planning application showed a boundary that did not correspond to the legally registered boundary as established by the 1987 municipal survey. I showed the committee the original survey document. I showed them Ingrid's measurement report. I showed them the drone footage, stills, and Felix's overlay analysis. I showed them the official municipal surveyor's written confirmation. I said, "The discrepancy is 1.87 metres across a boundary length of 22.4 metres. This strip of land is registered in the land registry as part of my property. The planning application as submitted includes this land in the development site. The site plan is therefore inaccurate." Frau Drexel looked at the documents. She looked at the committee members on either side of her. She said, "Can you also address the matter of the boundary marker?" I said, "Yes. The original survey marker, an iron post installed during the 1987 survey, was removed at some point in the past 3 months. Its removal is documented by comparison of current photographs with older imagery. A formal complaint regarding this removal has been submitted to the relevant authority, as the removal of a registered survey marker is an offence under property law. That complaint is currently under review." I sat down. There was a silence in the room that had a particular quality to it, not dramatic, more like the moment after someone has explained a very simple thing that has very large implications, and everyone in the room is working through those implications quietly. Mans's lawyer stood up and began to speak. He said the objection was based on outdated documents. He said survey markers could shift over time due to ground movement. He said the site plan had been prepared by a licensed planning consultant. He said several other things that I will not recount in detail because they were not persuasive, and I suspect he knew they were not persuasive even as he said them. Ingrid raised her hand from the seat beside me. Frau Drexel acknowledged her. Ingrid stood. She introduced herself, including her credentials, 38 years as a licensed state surveyor, retired. She said, in the measured tone of someone who has given expert testimony before and found it straightforward, "Ground movement does not relocate iron survey posts by 1.87 metres in a straight line parallel to a property boundary. That is not how ground movement works. What I measured on site is consistent with deliberate relocation of the marker or installation of a replacement marker at an incorrect position. The 1987 coordinates are unambiguous. The current position of the replacement stake is unambiguous. The discrepancy is unambiguous." She sat down. Frau Drexel said, "Thank you." She said it to Ingrid. She did not look at Mans's lawyer. The committee went into a brief recess. I sat in my chair with my folder on my lap. I looked at the green cardboard cover of it. I thought about Walter and his spirit level and his stubbornness. I thought about the way the rose hedge smells in late May when it comes into bloom, the particular sweetness of it in the early evening. Felix leaned over from the seat behind me and said very quietly, "You're doing great." I said, "I know." When the committee reconvened, Frau Drexel spoke for approximately 4 minutes. The substance of what she said was this: the planning application as submitted could not be approved because the site plan contained a material inaccuracy regarding the property boundary. The application would be suspended pending a formal boundary determination by the municipal surveying authority. The applicant could resubmit once the boundary matter was legally resolved. The committee noted the documentation submitted by the objecting party and would forward it to the relevant departments. She said it without drama. She said it the way you read a bus timetable. It was, she seemed to suggest, simply the correct outcome given the evidence, and there was nothing remarkable about it. Mans's lawyer said something in a low voice to Mans. Mans said something back. His voice was controlled, but his face was doing something it had probably not done in a professional setting for a long time. It was losing its composition. The confidence that had been sitting on it like a mask was slipping, not dramatically, not in a collapse, but in the way a mask slips when the person wearing it has forgotten, briefly, to hold it in place. He looked at me. I looked back at him. I did not smile. I did not say anything. I simply looked at him with the calm attention of a woman who had been watching through her kitchen window for quite some time. The meeting moved on to the next agenda item. People began to shift in their seats, to gather papers, to murmur to their neighbours. The journalist was writing in her notebook. Felix was quietly closing his laptop. Mans stood up abruptly. He said, loudly enough that the room went briefly quiet again, "This is not over. This documentation is disputed. We will be seeking our own expert assessment." Frau Drexel looked up from her papers. She said pleasantly, "Of course, that is your right. The process will proceed through the appropriate channels." It was not a confrontation. It was a door closing, politely, firmly, in his face. He left. His lawyer followed him. The young man with the rolled-up plan followed both of them, looking uncomfortable. Ingrid touched my arm. She said, "Tea?" I said, "Absolutely." In the weeks that followed, several things happened in sequence. The Municipal Surveying Authority conducted its formal boundary determination. It confirmed in an official document that now lives in my green folder that the legal boundary of my property is exactly where the 1987 survey said it was. The determination was binding. The formal complaint about the removed boundary marker was investigated. I will not say what the outcome of that investigation was in precise legal terms because it is still, technically, in process. What I will say is that Mans's lawyers spent a significant amount of time communicating with the relevant authority, and that the investigation did not close quickly or quietly. Mans's planning application was resubmitted, eventually with a corrected site plan. The corrected site plan showed my property boundary in its correct position, which meant his development footprint was smaller than originally planned. The revised design required significant reworking. The timeline for the project was pushed back by at least 8 months. In development, time is money in a very direct and non-metaphorical sense. The article in the local paper was not long. It ran on page 7. It described the committee meeting, the objection, the suspension of the application, and the boundary documentation. It mentioned that a formal complaint regarding a survey marker had been submitted. It did not name Mans by name because the journalist was careful and the legal situation was still active. But it described the project and the location with enough specificity that anyone in the neighbourhood who read it knew exactly what it was about. I know this because 3 separate neighbours mentioned it to me in the following week. One of them, a man named Herr Schmidt, who had lived on the street for 40 years and had never previously said more than good morning to me, stopped me on the pavement and shook my hand. He said, "Well done." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Walter would have been pleased." I said, "Yes, he would have." I did not cry. I waited until I was back inside, and then I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the photograph on the wall, the one from the Summer of the Roses. Then I went to the kitchen and made tea, and I sat at the table with my hands around the warm cup, and I let myself feel, for a few minutes, the particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Mans did not come back to my door. His lawyer sent a letter to Dr. Fellerer that was, in its way, a kind of retreat dressed up as a procedural communication. It acknowledged the boundary determination. It made no further claim on the disputed strip of land. It contained no apology, which I had not expected, and no acknowledgement of what had been attempted, which I had also not expected. Legal letters rarely contain honesty. That is not what they are for. Dr. Feller wrote back. Her letter was short, precise, and noted that her client would be monitoring the ongoing boundary situation and expected it to be respected in all future planning and construction activity. She sent me a copy. I put it in the green folder. The green folder is getting quite thick now. In late April, when the weather turned properly warm and the light in the garden went golden in the evenings, the way it does in spring, I went out to the southern boundary and I stood there for a while, looking at the strip of land. The replacement stake was gone. The municipal surveyors had removed it during their assessment. The disturbed earth where the original marker had been was settling back. The rose hedge needed attention. I had been thinking about what to do with the boundary, not in a defensive way, in a deliberate, considered, forward-looking way. Walter had planted the roses there because he liked the idea of a living boundary, something that grew and changed and was unmistakably alive. I had been thinking about extending that idea. I went to the garden centre the following Saturday. I spent an hour there, talking to one of the staff members, a young woman who knew her plants and had strong opinions about soil pH. I came home with a plan and a significant quantity of material. 3 new rose varieties to extend the hedge, a row of lavender for the front section where the light was stronger, 2 small ornamental apple trees to companion the old one, and, for the corner where the compost bins were, a vigorous climbing rose that would, within 2 seasons, make that corner emphatically and visibly mine in a way that no document and no legal determination could quite match for sheer physical presence. Ingrid came to help on the first planting day. Felix came too, uninvited but welcome, and proved surprisingly useful with a spade. We worked for most of the morning, measuring spacing, preparing soil, setting plants. Ingrid had brought a proper planting plan drawn on graph paper because she was constitutionally incapable of doing anything without proper documentation, which was one of the things I liked best about her. At some point during the morning, I became aware that there was activity on the other side of the fence. A crew member from the construction site, taking a break, watching us work. He was young, maybe 25, and he watched with the uncomplicated curiosity of someone who has no stake in the situation and simply finds it interesting. I looked up at him. I said, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning. That's going to be beautiful." I said, "That's the idea." He nodded and went back to his work. I went back to mine. By noon, the southern boundary of my garden was planted from one end to the other. The roses were in. The lavender was in. The ornamental apples were staked and settled. The climbing rose was set at the corner post with its first tendrils already reaching. None of it would look like much until the growing season was fully underway. But the structure was there. The intention was there. The boundary was marked in the oldest and most permanent way available to a person who owns a piece of land, by growing something on it. We ate lunch in the conservatory. Ingrid had brought a cake. Felix ate 2 pieces and talked about drones. I sat with my tea, looking out through the glass at the garden, at the fresh-turned earth along the southern edge, at the small green plants that were already, even on their first day, beginning to be part of the place. I thought about Mans, not with anger, with something more like a detached curiosity about the particular kind of calculation he had made and how completely it had failed. He had looked at me and seen a widow in a small house on her own with a garden she couldn't defend. He had seen a situation to be exploited. He had been so confident in his assessment that he had not considered, even briefly, that he might be wrong. That confidence was, in the end, the thing that undid him. Not my documents, not Ingrid's expertise, not Felix's drone footage, not Dr. Feller's letters, not the committee meeting. All of those were just the mechanism. The real cause was that he had decided, before he even knocked on my door, that I was someone he could push around. And that decision was so complete, so settled in him, that he never once adjusted it. He walked into that committee room still believing it. I do not know what he is like at home. I do not know what he tells himself about what happened. I do not know if he has ever, in his life, been made to feel the specific discomfort of being very thoroughly and publicly wrong about something he was very thoroughly confident about. I suspect not. I suspect it was a new experience. I hope he learned something from it. I genuinely do. Not for his sake particularly. For the sake of the next person he decides to look at and see someone who can be pushed around. But I do not spend much time thinking about him. There are better things to think about. The roses along the southern boundary came into bloom in late May, as they always do. The 3 new varieties I planted were different from Walter's original hedge, a little wilder, a little more extravagant in colour. But they were planted in the same soil, on the same strip of ground, in the same garden. The old hedge and the new plants grew alongside each other without difficulty. That is what roses do, if you give them the right conditions. They grow. On the morning they first opened properly, I took my tea outside and stood at the boundary and looked at them for a long time. The light was early and low, and the dew was still on the grass. The construction noise from next door had not started yet. The street was quiet. A blackbird was doing something complicated and opinionated in the apple tree. I put my hand on the fence post at the corner, the one where the climbing rose was already beginning to establish itself, and I stood there in my garden, on my land, inside my legal boundary, and I felt something that I can only describe as settled. Walter used to say that the best revenge was a well-maintained garden. He was, as usual, not entirely wrong. But I think what I felt that morning was something more than revenge and less complicated than victory. It was simply the feeling of still being here, of having stood my ground, quietly and precisely and without fuss, and of still being here. The tea had gone cold again. I didn't mind. I went inside and made a fresh cup and sat at the kitchen table with the green folder in front of me. Not because I needed to look at anything in it, but because it was there and it was full, and everything in it meant that this house and this garden were mine, documented and defended, and fully, completely mine. I put my hand on the cover of the folder. I thought, that's enough. It was.